Michele Williams, the beautiful blonde girl with doll-like eyes, once captivated everyone. Greg Williams, the charming husband, seemed like a prince straight out of a fairy tale. But this was no fairy tale. A scream shattered the quiet suburban night. The door burst open, and Michele ran outside in a panic. Neighbors startled awake. Lights flickered on in nearby houses. 911 received the call. Inside their home, Greg lay on the floor with 3 gunshot wounds. The police arrived within minutes, but it was too late. A shocking murder case, and the media swarmed like vultures hunting for news. Michele claimed it was self-defense, an unexpected attack. But was it really, or would the police uncover enough dark secrets to bring her down? Columbus, Ohio, September 30, 1993. Michele Williams, 23 years old, ran out of her newly rented townhouse, her bare feet pressing against the cold pavement. Her scream tore through the silent night. Neighbors jolted awake, pulling back curtains to peek outside as lights flickered on one by one. Someone broke into the house. He shot my husband. A moment of stunned silence, then chaos erupted. Someone dialed 911. Within minutes, sirens wailed across the neighborhood. First responders rushed inside and found Greg Williams slumped in the living room chair, his body covered in blood. 3 bullets, 2 piercing his chest, 1 lodged in his arm. All efforts to save him were futile. Outside, Michele trembled, tears streaming down her face. She was so distraught that the police had to calm her down. Once she regained her composure, she described the shooter who had supposedly fled. Immediately, the entire neighborhood was locked down, and police launched a manhunt. But while officers chased a faceless suspect, something else arrived even faster: the media. Reporters crowded in front of the house, cameras pointing directly at the young widow, the woman who had just lost her husband in a brutal murder. Michele tearfully urged the police to find the killer, and by that night, her face was everywhere on the news. But this was just the beginning of a bizarre story, one that would not only unravel Michele's secrets, but also take a turn that no one could have predicted. Born in 1970 in Columbus, Ohio, Michele Clayman had a peaceful childhood in a middle-class family. After graduating from high school in 1988, she chose to stay close to home and continue her education at a nearby university. But before starting college that fall, Michele took a summer job at the Northwest Swim Club, and it was there that she met Greg Williams. Greg was 7 years older than Michele, also a Columbus native. He was a cheerful, sociable guy and an outstanding swimmer. After graduating high school in 1981, instead of going straight to college, Greg took a different path. He joined the U.S. Air Force, where he served for 4 years. After his service, he returned home to pursue a degree in accounting at Ohio State University and resumed his passion for swimming, becoming a coach at the Northwest Swim Club. One summer day in 1988, as the golden sunlight reflected off the clear blue pool, Greg saw Michele for the first time. He was immediately drawn to her delicate beauty and her large, doll-like eyes. Before long, they started dating. Their relationship was steady, not overly passionate, but enduring over time. After graduating, Michele and Greg decided to start a new life in Denver, Colorado. Their wedding took place in April 1992, and Michele, a 21-year-old bride, radiated happiness on her big day. 8 months later, life in Denver was no longer as exciting as it once seemed. Michele started feeling homesick. The unfamiliarity of a new city made her feel lost. It didn't take long for Michele to convince Greg to move back to Columbus. And as always, Greg was willing to do anything to make his wife happy. On September 29, 1993, as Greg and Michele parked their moving truck outside their newly rented townhouse, it seemed like everything was set for a happy homecoming after 18 months in Denver. But in the end, their story turned into a tragedy. On the afternoon of September 30, 1993, Columbus, Ohio police launched a manhunt for the person who shot Greg Williams. The only witness was Michele Williams. The victim's distraught wife. Michele told the police that a white man wearing a tool belt had broken into their home. At the time, she was in the kitchen, while Greg was taking a nap on the living room couch. The intruder suddenly stormed in, said nothing, pulled out a gun, and fired 3 shots. Greg collapsed immediately. As the man fled through the back door, Michele ran to the front, screaming hysterically, prompting neighbors to call 911. Within minutes, police officers and paramedics arrived. While doctors fought to save Greg's life, the hunt for the shooter began. But there was one major problem. No one in the neighborhood had seen this stranger. The only hope the police had now was Michele. They took her to the central police station for a detailed statement. In the interrogation room, Michele recounted her story. At first, she thought it was a robbery. But if it was a robbery, why didn't he take anything? Michele then offered another theory. Perhaps Greg had been murdered over debt. He had borrowed $1,000 from a high-interest lender to bet on football a few years ago. The police were skeptical. Would such a small debt from years ago be a strong enough motive for such a bold murder? Moreover, one thing stood out to the investigators. Michele had no injuries at all, not a single scratch. Was she just incredibly lucky, or was there another explanation? The police decided to conduct a gunshot residue test on Michele's hands, an important test to determine whether she had fired a gun. Michele agreed immediately. But as soon as the investigator stepped out of the room for a moment, she began to panic. Her breathing grew rapid, her hands clenched tightly, and anxiety was written all over her face. Her mother, who was with her, also noticed the sudden change in her behavior. When the investigator returned, Michele trembled and confessed, "I touched his chest." The investigators exchanged glances before calmly responding, "Don't worry, there's a difference between touching a blood-stained shirt and firing a gun." Michele nodded, seeming somewhat reassured. Eventually, she agreed to take the gunshot residue test to confirm whether she had fired a weapon. When the test was completed, Michele's father arrived at the police station. He walked into the interrogation room with devastating news. Greg didn't make it. Michele froze, her face turning pale. She burst into tears, but amidst her sobs, her anxiety was evident. It wasn't just grief over losing her husband. There seemed to be something else. The police continued, questioning her. "Have you ever purchased a gun before?" Michele hesitated, her eyes darting away. A long silence followed before she finally admitted, "Yes, I bought a gun while I was in Colorado a few months ago." She quickly added that she hadn't brought it to Columbus, claiming she had discarded it long ago. The investigators listened, taking notes, but no one was entirely convinced. Afterward, Michele was allowed to leave, saying she would go to her parents' house to rest after the shock of losing her husband. On September 30, 1993, less than 6 hours after the horrific shooting, Michele Williams became the center of a highly suspicious investigation. Her husband, Greg Williams, 30 years old, had been shot dead inside their home in Columbus. Initially, Michele claimed that an intruder was responsible. But as the police began digging deeper, her story didn't quite add up. Michele's unusual reactions during the gun residue test only heightened the detectives' suspicions. But what truly caught their attention was her strange behavior. After the interrogation, Michele returned to the crime scene and insisted on entering the house. "I need to check on my cats," she insisted. But the police refused, and immediately Michele became oddly agitated. Meanwhile, the crime scene search team discovered a crucial detail upstairs. In a bedroom, they found a box buried in a pile of clothes. Inside, a gun was carefully hidden in a drawstring bag. This completely contradicted Michele's statement. She had previously claimed she discarded her gun when she left Colorado, but clearly she had not. Downstairs, the police continued their search and found Michele's wallet in the living room. Inside the wallet, they discovered something even more suspicious than bullets. If the bullets found inside matched the ones that killed Greg, the police would have the murder weapon in their hands, and all clues would point to Michele. But that wasn't the biggest shock. When searching her wallet, They also found a love letter addressed to a mysterious man in Colorado. What Michele wrote in the letter seemed like a veiled confession. If its contents were true, it suggested that Michele may have been having an affair. Michelle's letter was an aspect that needed to be explored. Was the boyfriend in Colorado an accomplice? The police knew they had to go to Colorado to interview this man. On October 3, just 3 days after Greg Williams' murder, investigators from Columbus flew to Colorado in search of answers. The mysterious man to whom Michele had sent the love letter was genuinely shocked to learn that Greg was dead. But what surprised him even more was the revelation that Michele had feelings for him. "We only flirted a little, but I never thought she was in love with me. So why did Michele create such a complicated love story in her head?" He stated that Michele had once confided in him that she was unhappy in her marriage with Greg. But if that unhappiness was a motive for murder, he had no idea. Investigators carefully observed his reactions. There were no signs of lying, no attempt at concealment. Ultimately, they ruled him out as a suspect, but the trip to Colorado was not entirely fruitless. They visited a gun store where Michele had claimed she had discarded her gun long ago. The store owner positively identified Michele as the person who had purchased the gun, contradicting her previous statement. However, the most crucial discovery came from Greg's former employers in Denver. When the police informed them of his death, they received a shocking piece of information. Greg had a life insurance policy worth $210. Not only that, but during his time at his former company, he had an additional insurance policy worth $100. The notable detail was that Greg had left the company some time ago, but the policy remained active only until the very last day of that month. Greg was murdered on September 30, just hours before the insurance policy expired. And most importantly, Michele Williams was the sole beneficiary. On October 6, 1993, the investigation reached a critical turning point when the crime lab sent back the ballistic test results. The gun found in the house was the very weapon that killed Greg Williams. And the most shocking detail? Michele had purchased that gun just 2 weeks before the murder. That same day, Columbus police arrived at the doorstep of Michele's parents' home with an arrest warrant. Before they could even knock, a crowd of reporters had already swarmed the front yard, ready to capture the dramatic moment. Inside the house, investigators confronted Michele and her family. "Michele Williams, you are under arrest for the murder of your husband." A heavy silence filled the room. No tears, no resistance. Michele remained eerily indifferent. But just seconds later, she fainted into the arms of a patrol officer. The police quickly escorted Michele to the patrol car, pushing through a sea of cameras and flashing lights. Greg Williams' family was in complete shock. They had believed Michele to be a loving wife. But by October 15, when the grand jury officially indicted Michele for first-degree murder, the truth began to emerge. The evidence against Michele was overwhelming. Yet despite everything, she remained steadfast in her innocence, determined to take the case to trial. In November 1993, as police and prosecutors continued to build their case, they received an unexpected tip from Michele's former employer in Colorado. He called to report that Michele's old company had just received a strange package, a product catalog from a company called Paladin Press. Investigators immediately looked into it and uncovered a chilling truth. Michele Williams had ordered a book from Paladin Press months before Greg's murder. The title of the book? Hitman, a technical manual for independent contractors, a step-by-step guide on how to commit the perfect murder. In other words, Michele had been planning to kill her husband for a long time. By early 1994, as the trial date approached, Michele's defense team began to panic. They reached out to the prosecution with a desperate proposal. Michele would plead guilty to manslaughter. But there was a problem. The sentence for manslaughter ranged from only 7 to 25 years. Greg's family was outraged. They could not accept the possibility that this cold-blooded killer might walk free after just a few years in prison. Ultimately, the prosecution countered with an offer, not first-degree murder with a life sentence, but second-degree murder with a minimum of 20 years behind bars. Now, the final decision was in Greg's family's hands. Accept the deal for a sentence of 15 years to life, or take the risk, reject the plea bargain, and let a jury decide Michelle's fate. The big question remained, were they willing to take Michele to trial and ensure full justice was served? By the spring of 1994, Michele Williams' legal team faced an inescapable reality. With the overwhelming amount of evidence collected by prosecutors, there was no doubt if the case went to trial, Michele, then 24 years old, would almost certainly be convicted of murdering her husband. Understanding this, her lawyers decided to approach the prosecution with a plea deal. Michele would plead guilty to murder in exchange for a sentence of 15 years to life. Greg's family, though furious over her crime, agreed to the deal to avoid a prolonged and painful trial. On May 12, 1994, Michele Williams officially pleaded guilty. After months of avoiding the victim's family, she finally had the chance to apologize. But what stood out was that Michele did not beg for forgiveness, nor did she express deep remorse. She simply accepted her guilt, her sentence, and the judgment passed upon her. More than 20 years later, Greg's family still struggles to understand how Michele could have so heartlessly shot her sleeping husband and then calmly staged a crime scene. How could a woman who seemed gentle, intelligent, and full of promise commit such a cold and ruthless act? It remains an unanswered question, a tragedy that Greg's loved ones will carry in their hearts forever.